Miss Marple and the Puzzle of the Vanishing Heiress. Chapter 1. The village of St. Ethelred's lay nestled between rolling green hills, a picture of unspoiled English charm. Thatched cottages lined the narrow lanes, their chimneys curling out lazy wisps of smoke into the crisp autumn air. The church bells tolled softly in the distance, signalling the hour of tea, an event that, in this sleepy town, was almost sacred. At the heart of the village, just past the old stone bridge, stood the Bluebell Tea Room, a place where gossip flowed as freely as the Earl Grey. Miss Marple, as was her habit, sat at her usual table near the window, knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. Her tea, a delicate jasmine blend, steamed in a fine china cup beside her, untouched as she listened to the murmurs of conversation around her. The talk of the town, as it had been for the past week, was the sudden and rather dramatic arrival of Miss Evelyn Lorimer. "She came out of nowhere, you see," whispered Mrs. Longworth to her companion, Mrs. Finch, the two of them peering conspiratorially over their teacups. One moment, Heatherly Hall was standing empty, quite abandoned, since old Sir Edgar passed, bless his soul, and then the next, there she was, claiming to be his long-lost niece. A very convenient niece, if you ask me, Mrs. Finch added, her thin lips pressing into a disapproving line. Why, no one had ever heard of her before. If she's truly a Lorimer, then I'm the Queen of England. Miss Marple listened, without seeming to, her needles clicking at an even rhythm. She had seen many such cases before, long-lost relatives appearing just in time to inherit a fortune. It was a story as old as time, yet no less intriguing for its familiarity. Evelyn Lorimer had come to Heatherly Hall with impeccable credentials. Her birth certificate, legal documents, even an old family locket containing a photograph of a much younger Sir Edgar, all pointed to her legitimacy. Yet something about the matter did not sit well with Miss Marple. There was an air of unease around it, a certain lack of history that made her suspicious. People who belonged to old families left traces, memories, stories, past connections, and yet no one in St. Ethelred's had ever heard of Evelyn Lorimer before she arrived. Miss Marple took a delicate sip of tea, her gaze drifting beyond the lace-curtained window. Across the street, the imposing silhouette of Heatherly Hall loomed, its ivy-clad walls bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. She had passed by the house just yesterday, taking her usual afternoon walk. She had noticed a light burning in an upstairs window, an unusual occurrence for a house so long abandoned. And yet, something about the flickering glow had struck her as odd. It had been unsteady, erratic, as though someone were moving about, inside their footsteps uncertain. As she pondered this, the bell above the tea-room's door jangled sharply, and Mrs. Harcourt, the owner, bustled out from behind the counter. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched the telephone receiver. "Ladies, forgive the interruption, but I've just had the most dreadful news," she said breathlessly. "Miss Lorimer has disappeared." A hush fell over the room. Even Mrs. Longworth and Mrs. Finch, who had spent the better part of their afternoon doubting Miss Lorimer's claim, fell silent. "Disappeared?" Mrs. Finch echoed, her voice quivering. "What do you mean, disappeared?" Mrs. Harcourt wrung her hands. "Mrs. Clemens, the housekeeper at Heatherly, telephoned just now. She went up to Miss Lorimer's room to bring her morning tea, and she was gone. The bed hadn't been slept in. Her travelling trunk was still there, but her handbag and coat were missing. It's as if she vanished into thin air. Miss Marple set down her teacup with quiet precision. She had known, from the moment she first heard of Evelyn Lorimer, that something was amiss, and now, it seemed, the mystery had only deepened. "Perhaps she simply left in the night," suggested Mrs. Longworth, though her tone betrayed her own doubts. She was an outsider, after all. Perhaps she changed her mind. Then why leave? Her trunk behind? Mrs. Finch countered. A lady doesn't simply vanish without her belongings. Miss Marple considered this. A woman who had fought so hard to claim an inheritance did not simply walk away from it, and yet the alternative explanation was far more unsettling. She rose from her chair, folding her knitting neatly into her bag. "I think," she said softly, "that it would be best if I paid Mrs. Clemens a visit." As she stepped out into the cool autumn air, a single thought lingered in her mind. If Evelyn Lorimer had not left Heatherly Hall of her own free will, then where had she gone? Chapter 2. Miss Marple walked briskly through the quiet village, her sensible shoes tapping lightly against the cobblestone path. The autumn air carried a crispness that whispered of approaching winter, but her mind was far too occupied to notice the chill. Heatherly Hall loomed ahead, its grand but neglected facade darkened by the overcast sky. She had always thought it a rather imposing house, too large for comfort, too shadowed by its own history. The once pristine gardens were now overgrown, ivy curling around the stone walls like creeping fingers, and somewhere within, Evelyn Lorimer had disappeared without a trace. A stout woman with a face lined by years of duty, Mrs. Clemens, the housekeeper, greeted Miss Marple at the door. Her apron was slightly askew, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief as she ushered the elderly detective inside. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful, simply dreadful," she fretted, leading the way through the dimly lit corridor. "I went to wake her at 7:30, just as I always do, but the room was empty. The bed hadn't been slept in, her clothes were still in the wardrobe, and I tell you, there was no sign of her anywhere." Miss Marple observed the surroundings keenly as they ascended the grand staircase. Dust clung to the corners of the banisters, and the faint scent of damp wood filled the air. A house long unlived in. "Did Miss Lorimer mention anything last night?" she inquired gently. Mrs. Clemens paused at the top of the stairs. "She did seem a little uneasy," she admitted. "I brought her supper on a tray, and she barely touched it, kept looking toward the window as if expecting something or someone." Miss Marple nodded, filing this away as they entered the bedroom. The room itself was elegantly furnished, but bore the unmistakable air of recent habitation. The wardrobe stood slightly ajar, revealing neatly hung dresses. A vanity table sat untouched, save for a silver hairbrush and a small perfume bottle. The bed, as Mrs. Clemens had said, remained undisturbed. Miss Marple moved to the window and peered outside. The gardens stretched below in untamed disarray, leading to a narrow pathway that disappeared into the woods beyond. She turned back to the housekeeper. "Did Miss Lorimer often go out at night?" Mrs. Clemens shook her head vehemently. "Oh, no, ma'am. She was a quiet sort. She'd take her walks in the afternoon, but once the sun set, she'd stay in. At least I thought she did." Miss Marple nodded, her sharp eyes scanning the room once more. And then she saw it. A single overturned teacup sat on the bedside table, a dark stain spreading across the lace doily beneath it. A minor detail, perhaps, but in Miss Marple's experience, it was often the smallest things that mattered most. "Tell me, Mrs. Clemens," she said thoughtfully, "who was the last person to see Miss Lorimer?" The housekeeper hesitated. "I suppose Mr. Bertram." Miss Marple's expression did not change, though she felt the familiar tingle of a puzzle beginning to take shape. "Mr. Bertram," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Bertram Phelps. He's the solicitor overseeing Miss Lorimer's inheritance. Came by yesterday evening. I saw them talking in the drawing-room, but I didn't hear what was said. He left around 9. Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against the arm of the chair. A lawyer, an heiress, and a vanished inheritance. It was an old tale, one she had heard many times before. "I think, Mrs. Clemens," she said, rising from her seat, "that I should very much like to speak with Mr. Bertram Phelps." Chapter 3. Miss Marple left Heatherly Hall with a sense of quiet determination. The housekeeper's testimony had been useful, perhaps more useful than Mrs. Clemens realized herself. A young heiress vanishing in the dead of night was strange enough, but a visit from her solicitor just hours before, that made it positively suspicious. As she walked through the village, the clouds above thickened, casting the once pleasant afternoon into gloom. She knew exactly where to find Mr. Bertram Phelps. His office stood just beyond the village square, a modest yet respectable establishment, with his name printed in neat gold lettering on the frosted glass. She pushed open the heavy oak door, and a small brass bell tinkled above her head. The reception area was tidy but unremarkable, with neatly stacked papers and a single umbrella propped against the wall. A young secretary, who could not have been more than 20, looked up from her typewriter with mild curiosity. "Mr. Phelps is with a client," she said hesitantly. "Would you care to wait, Miss Marple?" she said with a pleasant smile. "But I shouldn't like to impose. I merely wish to ask Mr. Phelps a few questions about Miss Evelyn Lorimer. May I?" The mention of the name. The girl stiffened ever so slightly. It was a subtle reaction, but Miss Marple had spent a lifetime noticing such things. I'm not sure if he's available," the secretary said quickly. "He's been terribly busy." "Ah," Miss Marple said mildly, "I do understand, but I am sure he wouldn't mind sparing a few minutes. After all, Miss Lorimer has vanished. That was all it took." The girl's eyes widened and her hands faltered over the typewriter keys. She swallowed visibly, as though trying to compose herself. I see. Let me check if he's free." She hurried through a side door, leaving Miss Marple to examine her surroundings. The office smelled faintly of old paper and ink, and though it was impeccably kept, there was a sense of quiet urgency in the air, an energy that suggested not all was in order. A moment later, the secretary returned, her face pale. "Mr. Phelps will see you now." Miss Marple stepped inside, finding herself in a well-appointed office lined with mahogany bookshelves. At the desk sat Mr. Bertram Phelps, a man in his early 50s with sharp features and a neatly pressed suit. He looked up with a mixture of curiosity and polite annoyance. "Miss Marple, is it?" he said, gesturing for her to sit. "What can I do for you?" She took the offered chair and folded her hands neatly in her lap. "I do apologize for the intrusion, Mr. Phelps, but I was hoping you could clarify a few things regarding Miss Lorimer's inheritance." His face remained impassive, but she caught the slight tightening of his jaw. "Miss Lorimer's affairs are private, Miss Marple," he said carefully, "but I can assure you, all legal matters have been settled. She provided the necessary documentation, and the estate was formally transferred to her name last week." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, of course. A remarkable turn of events, wouldn't you say, considering no one knew of her existence until recently?" His lips pressed together. "The law is clear, Miss Marple. She was Sir Edgar's only living relative. There were no other claimants." Miss Marple took a moment, adjusting her gloves as if lost in thought. "I understand you visited her last night," she said casually. "A rather late call for a solicitor, was it not?" For the first time, a flicker of something crossed his face. Annoyance? Or something deeper? "I had urgent matters to discuss with her," he said shortly. "And how did she seem?" He hesitated. "Tired. A little anxious, perhaps, but given the weight of her inheritance, that is hardly surprising." Miss Marple gave him a long, assessing look. "Tell me, Mr. Phelps, did Miss Lorimer ever mention being afraid?" There was a pause, just a fraction too long. "No," he said finally. "She never mentioned anything of the sort." Miss Marple nodded, but she knew a lie when she heard one. She stood, smoothing her skirt. "Well, I do appreciate your time, Mr. Phelps. It's always so reassuring to know that young ladies inheriting large fortunes have such trustworthy legal counsel." His eyes narrowed just slightly at that, but he said nothing. Miss Marple turned toward the door, pausing only once before she left. "Oh, and one last thing. If Miss Lorimer were to disappear permanently, what would happen to the estate?" Mr. Phelps stiffened. The matter would be complicated, of course. If she were proven deceased without an heir, the estate could potentially revert to the Crown. Or, in some cases, if legal disputes arise, certain interested parties could petition for alternative ownership. Miss Marple gave him a knowing smile. "How very interesting," she murmured, before slipping quietly out the door. As she stepped onto the street, she allowed herself a small sigh. Mr. Phelps was hiding something. Of that she was certain. But was he merely protecting his own interests, or had he played a role in Evelyn Lorimer's disappearance? One thing was clear. This mystery was far from over. Chapter 4. Miss Marple walked back through the village, her mind quietly assembling the pieces of the puzzle. Mr. Phelps had been uneasy. There was no doubt about that. He had answered her questions carefully, but the way his jaw tightened, the slight hesitation before he denied Miss Lorimer's fear, those were the signs of a man who was not telling the full truth. The question now was, had he merely been covering up for his own professional incompetence, or was he involved in something far more sinister? As she neared Heatherly Hall once more, she noticed a young man standing near the gate, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his tweed jacket. He had the air of someone uncertain whether to enter or walk away. Miss Marple recognized him at once. Peter Bertram, a local businessman and occasional suitor to young ladies of means. She approached him with a pleasant nod. "Good afternoon, Mr. Bertram." He startled slightly, then forced a smile. "Miss Marple. Didn't see you. There. Quite understandable. You seemed rather preoccupied." She tilted her head slightly. "You were close to Miss Lorimer, were you not?" He hesitated just long enough for Miss Marple to confirm her suspicions. "We were acquainted," he said finally. She was an interesting girl, a bit mysterious. I rather liked that about her." "Indeed. And when did you last see her?" He frowned. "2 nights ago. We had a walk around the grounds. She seemed—" He hesitated. "She seemed worried about something. Kept saying she felt like someone was watching her." Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes studied him carefully. "Did she say who she suspected?" He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "No. She just laughed it off in the end, said she was being silly. But she wasn't herself that night." Miss Marple pursed her lips. "And last night? You didn't visit her then?" He shook his head. "I was in town. Didn't get back until late." "A pity," she murmured. "For I do believe that something happened to Miss Lorimer last night, and whoever was responsible is hoping we shall think she left of her own accord." Peter Bertram stiffened. "You mean foul play?" Miss Marple gave him a serene but meaningful look. "I mean that young women do not vanish without reason, Mr. Bertram. And when they do, it is seldom a matter of their own choosing." A silence stretched between them. Then Peter cleared his throat. "Do you think she's—" He trailed off, unable to say the word. Miss Marple did not answer at once. "That depends, Mr. Bertram, on what we find next." She turned back toward the hall, her mind already working through her next steps. Inside Heatherly Hall, Mrs. Clemens was waiting, wringing her hands. "Oh, Miss Marple, thank heavens you're back. There's been another frightful thing." Miss Marple removed her hat and gloves calmly. "Do tell me, my dear." The housekeeper gestured toward the main sitting room. "It's the back door, ma'am. I found it unlocked just now. And the ground outside, it looks disturbed, like someone's been walking about in the garden at night." Miss Marple felt a ripple of interest. "Where exactly?" "In the rose garden, just beneath Miss Lorimer's bedroom window." A chill passed through Miss Marple. She recalled the way Evelyn had been seen looking out of that very window the night before she disappeared. She followed Mrs. Clemens outside, stepping carefully along the gravel path until they reached the garden. And there, in the damp soil, beneath the window, were footprints. Large, deep prints. A man's footprints. Miss Marple crouched slightly, observing the disturbed earth. The footprints led from the tree line to the house, and then back again, disappearing into the woods. Whoever had been here had been careful. No broken branches, no discarded items. But the message was clear. Someone had been watching Heatherly Hall. Someone had been watching Evelyn Lorimer. Miss Marple straightened slowly, dusting off her skirt. "Oh dear," she murmured. "This is turning out to be quite the dreadful affair." Mrs. Clemens clasped her hands together. "What do you think happened, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple glanced up at the empty window above them. "I think," she said softly, "that someone wanted Miss Lorimer out of the way, and last night they succeeded." Chapter 5. Miss Marple stood in the quiet garden of Heatherly Hall, her sharp eyes fixed on the disturbed earth beneath Evelyn Lorimer's window. The footprints, large, heavy, led away from the house toward the trees beyond the garden wall. Someone had been here in the dead of night, watching, waiting. The question was, had Evelyn gone willingly, or had she been taken? Mrs. Clemens shivered beside her, wringing her hands in distress. "Miss Marple, what do you think it means? Idiot! Do you think something awful has happened to her?" Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her mind was already working through the possibilities. "And it tells us that Miss Lorimer was not alone last night. Someone was near this house, perhaps even speaking to her, and now she is gone." A chill breeze rustled the leaves, and Miss Marple turned back toward the house. "I should like to see her room again, Mrs. Clemens. There may be something we overlooked." The housekeeper led the way up the grand staircase, the wooden steps creaking softly under their weight. Inside Evelyn's bedroom, the air was heavy with the scent of fading perfume. Nothing appeared disturbed. Her clothes still hung neatly. In the wardrobe, her silver hairbrush sat on the vanity, and yet there was an emptiness about the room, as if its occupant had left in haste. Miss Marple moved slowly, taking in every detail. Her sharp eyes landed once again on the overturned teacup beside the bed, the dark stain seeping into the lace doily beneath it. Carefully, she lifted the cup and sniffed. The faintest trace of something bitter lingered in the porcelain. "Does Miss Lorimer have any regular guests, Mrs. Clemens?" she asked. The housekeeper frowned. "Not many. Mr. Phelps, of course, came to handle the legal affairs, and Mr. Bertram, though I can't say she ever encouraged him much. And then there was—" She hesitated. "Yes," Miss Marple prompted gently. Mrs. Clemens sighed. "Well, there was a gentleman who came once, tall, dark-haired, rather serious-looking. He didn't give his name, and Miss Lorimer met him in the drawing-room. I remember, because she seemed quite agitated afterward." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around the teacup. "When was this?" "Just 2 nights ago. 2 nights ago." The same evening Evelyn had told Peter Bertram she felt she was being watched. The same evening she had been seen staring anxiously out of her window. A thought struck Miss Marple. She turned back to Mrs. Clemens. Was there anything missing from her belongings? Any papers, letters? Mrs. Clemens hesitated. "Now that you mention it, she did keep a small box on her writing desk. It had papers inside. I don't know what sort, but it's gone now." Miss Marple's lips pressed together in thought. Someone had come to see Evelyn. Someone she had not expected. And now she was gone, along with whatever was inside that box. She placed the teacup down carefully. "Mrs. Clemens, I believe I shall take a short walk to the police station. I do think it is time the authorities were informed." The police station. The small, tidy police station of St. Ethelred's was run by Inspector Graves, a man of steady temperament and a fondness for strong tea. He greeted Miss Marple with a mixture of respect and mild amusement. "Well, Miss Marple, what trouble do we have in the village today?" he asked, gesturing for her to sit. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. "It is rather serious, Inspector. Miss Evelyn Lorimer has disappeared." Graves raised an eyebrow. "Disappeared?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "She was last seen in her home last night, and this morning she was gone. There was no sign of struggle, but there were footprints beneath her window." The inspector sat forward, his expression growing more concerned. "Then do you believe foul play is involved?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "I should not like to assume anything just yet, but I do think we should ask ourselves why a young woman, having only just inherited a considerable fortune, would vanish so suddenly, and why, just before her disappearance, she should have been so unsettled." Graves nodded slowly. "Did she mention any threats? Any concerns?" Miss Marple hesitated only briefly. "She was troubled by something, and someone came to see her 2 nights ago, a man Mrs. Clemens did not recognize. I rather think we should discover who he was." Graves tapped his fingers against the desk, thoughtfully. "I'll send a constable to Heatherley Hall to look at those footprints, and I'll see if Mr. Phelps, her solicitor, has any idea who might have been in contact with her." Miss Marple inclined her head. "That would be most wise, Inspector. I fear time may be of the essence." Graves stood reaching for his coat. "I'll drive up to the hall myself. Would you care to accompany me?" Miss Marple smiled. "I should be delighted." A clue in the garden. The journey back to Heatherley Hall was made in solemn quiet. By the time they arrived, the afternoon had begun to fade into evening, and the grand old house stood silhouetted against the grey sky. Mrs. Clemens met them at the door, still flustered. "Inspector, thank goodness. Miss Marple, I've just remembered something odd, something I noticed this morning but didn't think much of." The inspector removed his hat. "And what is that, Mrs. Clemens?" She gestured toward the back garden. "There was a small scrap of paper caught in the rose bushes. I didn't look too closely at it, but it seemed out of place." The 3 of them walked swiftly toward the garden. Sure enough, fluttering among the thorny branches was a torn fragment of paper. Inspector Graves carefully pulled it free and unfolded it. The writing was smudged, the ink blurred by morning dew, but a few words remained legible. "Meet me. After dark. Must speak to you alone." Miss Marple peered at it, her mind working swiftly. "It appears Miss Lorimer was expecting someone." Graves frowned. "But who?" Miss Marple turned toward the house. "That, Inspector, is the question we must answer, and I suspect the answer lies closer than we think." Chapter 6. Inspector Graves held the damp scrap of paper between his fingers, his sharp eyes scanning the few words still legible. "Meet me. After dark. Must speak to you. Alone." The ink had smudged in places, but the message was clear enough. Evelyn Lorimer had arranged a secret meeting with someone the night she disappeared. Miss Marple, standing beside him in the cool evening air, observed the torn edges of the note. It had been hastily ripped, likely in distress or urgency. Someone, perhaps Evelyn herself, had tried to dispose of it before it was discovered. "Mrs. Clemens," the inspector said, turning to the anxious housekeeper, "do you recognize the handwriting?" She hesitated. I can't say for sure. Miss Lorimer had lovely, neat handwriting. This looks rather rushed, but I don't recall seeing a note like this in her room." Miss Marple nodded. "That would suggest she had it with her when she left, or when she was taken." A silence settled over them. The shadows of the garden lengthened as the sun began to dip below the horizon. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a lonely, echoing sound. Inspector Graves folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "Well, We have proof she intended to meet someone. The question is, who? Miss Marple tapped a thoughtful finger against her chin. If I may make a suggestion, Inspector, I do think we should return to Mr. Phelps. He was the last known person to see her before she vanished. Graves nodded. Agreed. And if he doesn't have an answer, we'll have to start looking into any acquaintances she might have had before coming to St. Ethelred's. They returned to the waiting car, and within minutes they were on the road back to the village, the weight of Evelyn Lorimer's disappearance pressing heavily upon them. An interrogation at the solicitor's office, the golden lettering on the frosted glass door of Bertram Phelps. Solicitor gleamed faintly in the dimming light as Inspector Graves and Miss Marple stepped inside. The office was quiet, save for the distant sound of a typewriter clicking away in the back room. The secretary looked up, startled at the unannounced visitors. I'm afraid Mr. Phelps is about to leave for the evening," she stammered. Graves gave a curt nod. "Then we'll only keep him for a moment." Before the girl could protest further, the inspector strode past her and opened the door to Mr. Phelps's private office. The solicitor, a lean, stiffly composed man, looked up sharply. A brief flicker of irritation crossed his face before he masked it with polite professionalism. "Inspector Graves, Miss Marple, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Graves closed the door behind him. "We have further questions regarding Miss Lorimer's disappearance." Phelps's expression did not change. "I already told you everything I know." Miss Marple, ever unassuming, took a seat opposite his desk. She smiled pleasantly. "Oh, I am sure you told us many things, Mr. Phelps, but I do wonder if you might clarify a few details." Phelps's fingers drummed lightly against the polished surface of his desk. "Such as?" Inspector Graves pulled out the torn note and placed it before him. "We found this in the gardens of Heatherley Hall. It appears Miss Lorimer was expecting someone the night she vanished. Do you know anything about this?" Phelps's eyes flickered down to the paper. He gave it a cursory glance, then leaned back in his chair. "I've never seen it before." Graves narrowed his gaze. "You were the last known person to see Miss Lorimer. Are you certain you don't know who she might have been meeting?" Phelps exhaled slowly. "Look, I did visit her that evening, but only to go over some final legal matters regarding the estate. She seemed distracted, but she didn't mention meeting anyone." Miss Marple studied him carefully. Did she seem frightened? For the first time, Phelps hesitated. A slight flicker of discomfort passed over his face. "I wouldn't say frightened, but she was certainly uneasy." "About what?" Graves pressed. Phelps sighed. "She asked if there had been any other claimants to the Lorimer estate, anyone who might contest her inheritance." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And were there?" Phelps hesitated again, then shook his head. "None that I know of." Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes caught the subtle pause before his answer. He was lying, or at least not telling them the full truth. Graves tapped his fingers against the desk. Did she mention anyone following her, or receiving any threats? Phelps's gaze flickered to Miss Marple before returning to the inspector. "No," he said finally, "she didn't." A lie. Miss Marple was certain of it. She gave Phelps a kindly smile. "Then I do wonder, Mr. Phelps, why Miss Lorimer seemed to think she was in danger." Phelps stiffened slightly. Perhaps she was simply nervous about inheriting such a large estate. A young woman alone, Miss Marple interrupted gently. But she wasn't alone, was she? You were there, and so was the mysterious gentleman who visited her 2 nights ago. The room went silent. Phelps's fingers tightened around the armrests of his chair. A bead of sweat glistened at his temple. Graves straightened. So, you do know who he was? Phelps's jaw clenched. I didn't say that. But you didn't deny it, Miss Marple said softly. The solicitor swallowed. His composed facade was beginning to crack. Graves leaned in, voice firm. Who was he, Phelps? A long silence followed. Then, finally, Phelps exhaled sharply. His name is Victor Rawlings, Miss Marple blinked. Rawlings? Phelps nodded, rubbing a hand over his face. He's an old associate of Sir Edgar Lorimer. Used to be in business together before things went sour. He turned up at my office asking about the estate as soon as Evelyn inherited it. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Graves. Graves frowned. And did he meet Miss Lorimer? Phelps hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. Yes, 2 nights ago. But I swear I didn't think much of it. He just wanted to speak to her. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the handle of her handbag. And now she is gone. Graves stood abruptly. Where can we find this Victor Rawlings? Phelps swallowed. He's staying at the Fox and Hound Inn on the edge of the village. Graves nodded sharply. Then I think it's time we paid Mr. Rawlings a visit. Miss Marple rose, her expression thoughtful. Yes, Inspector. I do believe we are getting very close. As they stepped out of the office and into the cool night air, Miss Marple felt a strange certainty settle within her. Victor Rawlings had sought out Evelyn Lorimer, and now she was missing. Whatever had happened that night, she suspected they were about to uncover the truth. Chapter 7. The Fox and Hound Inn stood on the outskirts of St. Ethelred's, a squat, unassuming building with a low-beamed ceiling and a roaring fire that filled the place with a warm, flickering glow. It was the kind of establishment that welcomed weary travellers and locals alike, a place where secrets were exchanged over pints of ale, and where a man could disappear into the background if he wished. Inspector Graves and Miss Marple stepped inside, the scent of tobacco and old wood lingering in the air. A few villagers occupied the tables, engaged in quiet conversations, but no one paid them much attention. Graves strode toward the bar, where the innkeeper, a burly man with a thick moustache, was polishing a glass. "We're looking for a Mr. Victor Rawlings," the inspector said, his tone firm but civil. The innkeeper eyed him warily before jerking his thumb toward the back of the room. "He's got the last room down the hall, but I'd watch myself if I were you. He's not the friendly sort." Graves exchanged a glance with Miss Marple before nodding. "We'll take our chances." The hallway was dimly lit, the floorboards creaking beneath their steps. Graves knocked sharply on the door. Silence. He knocked again, louder this time. "Mr. Rawlings, this is Inspector Graves. We need to speak with you." More silence. Graves turned the handle. Locked. Miss Marple, standing just behind him, tilted, her head slightly. "Perhaps he isn't in," she suggested. Graves frowned, Or perhaps he doesn't want to be disturbed. From inside the room, there was a faint rustling sound, a movement, brief but unmistakable. Graves stepped back, giving the door a hard shove. The latch groaned, but it held. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on his arm. "Inspector, if I may." Graves hesitated, then stepped aside as Miss Marple leaned forward. "Mr. Rawlings," she called softly, "we know about your meeting with Miss Lorimer. We know you came to St. Ethelred's for a reason, and we also know that she is missing." A long silence followed. Then from inside came a slow, deliberate sound, the turning of a lock. The door creaked open an inch, revealing a man's face, shadowed by the dim light. Victor Rawlings was tall, with dark hair and deep-set eyes that held a wariness Miss Marple had seen before, the look of a man who knew more than he was willing to share. "What do you want?" His voice was low, edged with something close to irritation. Graves stepped forward. "To ask you a few questions about Miss Evelyn Lorimer." Rawlings exhaled sharply. "I don't know anything about that." Miss Marple's expression remained mild, but her gaze was sharp. "Then why did you meet with her 2 nights ago?" Rawlings hesitated. He glanced down the hallway, as if weighing his options, then sighed and stepped back, opening the door fully. "Fine, come in." A confession of secrets. The room was sparse. A simple bed and a wooden chair, the only furniture aside from a battered suitcase in the corner. A half-empty glass of whiskey sat on the bedside table. Rawlings ran a hand through his hair, looking more tired than anything else. "Look, I didn't come here to cause trouble," he said, sinking into the chair. "I just wanted answers." Graves crossed his arms. "Answers about what?" Rawlings exhaled heavily. "I knew Edgar Lorimer years ago. We were in business, together, a shipping venture, but things soured. He accused me of fraud. I accused him of the same. It got messy." He rubbed his temple. "Then he died, and I thought that was the end of it. But then this niece of his appears out of nowhere, claiming his estate. It didn't sit right with me." Miss Marple studied him carefully. "You believed she was lying?" Rawlings shook his head. "Not necessarily, but Edgar never once mentioned having a niece, and the timing, her showing up just as the estate was about to be claimed by the Crown, felt too perfect." Graves frowned. "So you confronted her?" "I spoke to her," Rawlings corrected. "Told her I knew Edgar better than most. Asked her to tell me something, anything about her uncle that wasn't in legal documents. She got flustered, said she needed time." Miss Marple tapped her fingers lightly against her handbag. "And did she seem frightened?" Rawlings hesitated. "Yes," he admitted. "She was nervous, kept looking toward the window, like she expected someone to be watching." Graves narrowed his eyes. "And what happened after that?" Rawlings sighed. "I left. Figured if she was lying, it would come out eventually." His jaw tightened. "Then the next morning, I heard she was gone." Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "Mr. Rawlings, did you follow her that night?" His head snapped up. "No, I'd swear it. I wanted the truth, but I wouldn't." He cut himself off, shaking his head. "I wouldn't harm her." Miss Marple believed him, but that didn't mean someone else hadn't. She glanced at Graves, who seemed to be weighing the same thought. "You've been in town since she disappeared?" Graves asked. Rawlings nodded. Didn't want to leave until I got some real answers. Miss Marple's gaze drifted towards the window. Outside, the village lay in darkness, the street lamps casting long, eerie shadows. Something still wasn't right. Evelyn Lorimer had disappeared after arranging a meeting. Someone had left footprints beneath her window. Someone had taken the small box of documents from her room. And now Miss Marple had a nagging suspicion that they were missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. She turned back to Rawlings. Tell me, Mr. Rawlings, if you had to guess, who do you think wanted Evelyn Lorimer gone? Rawlings' expression hardened. If she wasn't Edgar's real heir, then someone else stood to gain from her disappearance. Graves folded his arms. And who would that be? Rawlings met his gaze steadily. Bertram Phelps. Miss Marple's lips pressed together. She had suspected the solicitor from the beginning, but now the threads were tightening around him. Graves straightened. I think it's time we had another chat with Mr. Phelps. Miss Marple, ever composed, gave a small smile. Yes, Inspector, I do believe we are getting quite close to the truth. Chapter 8. Inspector Graves wasted no time. As soon as Victor Rawlings uttered the name Bertram Phelps, the decision was made. Within minutes he and Miss Marple were making their way back, through the village toward the solicitor's office. It was now well into the evening, the quiet streets illuminated only by flickering gas lamps. A damp mist had begun to roll in from the moors, curling around the stone buildings like ghostly fingers. Miss Marple, though appearing calm as ever, was deep in thought. Bertram Phelps had been evasive from the beginning. He had claimed Evelyn was the rightful heir, yet he had also hesitated when asked about other potential claimants. More importantly, he had been the last person to see her alive, at least the last person they knew of. But if he was behind Evelyn's disappearance, what was his motive? They reached Phelps's office, but before Graves could knock, Miss Marple gently placed a hand on his arm. "Inspector," she said softly, "I do believe we should approach this carefully." Graves nodded grimly. "Agreed. If he's involved, he'll be expecting questions." Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, indeed, but a man who believes himself clever is often the easiest to catch." Graves rapped sharply on the door. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Miss Marple peered at the frosted glass window. A faint light glowed from within. "He's here," she murmured. Graves tried the handle. The door was locked. "Phelps," he called, raising his voice. "This is Inspector Graves. Open the door." Silence. Then from inside came the faintest sound, the scrape of a chair being pushed back. Graves gave Miss Marple a quick glance before stepping back and delivering a swift, forceful kick to the door. The wood groaned before swinging open with a splintering crack. Inside, the office was dimly lit by a single desk lamp. Papers were scattered across the desk, and an empty whiskey glass sat beside them. And behind the desk, slumped over in his chair, was Bertram Phelps. Miss Marple inhaled sharply. Graves stepped forward cautiously, checking for a pulse. After a long moment he exhaled and shook his head. "Dead." Miss Marple moved closer, her keen eyes scanning the scene. "Poison," she murmured, noting the faint discoloration around his lips. Graves frowned. Suicide? Miss Marple tilted her head. Perhaps. Or perhaps someone wanted to ensure he never answered any more of our questions. She leaned over the desk, her fingers lightly brushing a crumpled piece of paper beside Phelps's limp hand. It was a letter, hastily written. The ink was smudged in places, as if he had hesitated or struggled while writing it. I had no choice. It was too dangerous. She wasn't supposed to know. They made sure she disappeared. I didn't mean for it to happen, but I can't fix it now. The truth will come out soon enough. There was no signature. Graves read the words over Miss Marple's shoulder. They? Who is they? Miss Marple straightened slowly, her expression thoughtful. That, Inspector, is what we must find out. She turned to the scattered papers on the desk. I do believe we should search for anything relating to Miss Lorimer's inheritance. If Phelps was keeping secrets, they may still be here. Graves nodded and began sorting through the documents. Many were routine legal papers, contracts, land deeds, client records. But then Miss Marple's fingers brushed against something unusual, a second will. Her eyes widened slightly. The document was old, its edges yellowed with age. Unlike the official will that had granted Evelyn Lorimer her inheritance, this one was dated several years earlier, and it named a different heir. Graves took the document and read it aloud. The Lorimer estate is to pass to my godson, Richard Lorimer, or his direct descendants in the event of my passing. Miss Marple's voice was quiet but firm. So there was another claimant, and Phelps knew. Graves exhaled sharply, which means Evelyn Lorimer may not have been the true heir after all. Miss Marple folded her hands. And if someone else stood to gain from her disappearance, then perhaps we have been looking in the wrong direction entirely. Graves rubbed his temple. But why go to the trouble of removing Evelyn if the will wasn't valid anymore? If this Richard Lorimer, or his heirs, had a legal claim, they could have contested it in court. Miss Marple tapped the document lightly. But what if they knew they wouldn't win? If Evelyn's claim was strong, legal disputes could take years. But if she disappeared, the matter would become much simpler. Graves's jaw tightened, so they removed her before she could defend her claim. Miss Marple nodded, and now perhaps they have removed Phelps as well, a man who knew too much. A tense silence settled over them. Then Graves straightened. We need to find out who Richard Lorimer was and if he had any living descendants. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, Inspector. I do believe that is the next step, a lead into the past. The village records were kept at the parish office, a small but well-maintained building near St. Ethelred's Church. The vicar, a kindly man with wire-rimmed glasses, greeted them with curiosity as they explained their request. Richard Lorimer? He repeated, adjusting his spectacles. Yes, I believe we have some records. He was Sir Edgar's cousin, if I recall correctly. Moved away years ago. He led them to a set of old parish registers, carefully stored in wooden cabinets. Graves and Miss Marple combed through the records until, finally, they found the name they were looking for. Richard Lorimer. Deceased 1928? Miss Marple tapped the page thoughtfully. So, Richard himself is long gone. But did he have children? The year vicar flipped to another section. Ah, here we are. Yes, he had a son, James Lorimer, born 1905. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. And James? The vicar hesitated, tracing his finger down the page. It says he moved abroad. South America, I believe. Lost contact with the family after the war. Graves muttered under his breath. If James had a child, they would be the rightful heir now. Miss Marple's voice was calm, but certain. And I suspect that someone already knew that. Graves met her gaze. You mean? Miss Marple nodded. I mean that someone in this village was aware of the real heir all along, and they have been working very hard to ensure Evelyn Lorimer, and anyone else who knew the truth, was removed from the equation. A silence settled over them. Finally, Graves exhaled sharply. We need to find out who in Viotuine. St. Ethelred's had the most to gain from this, and fast. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. Yes, Inspector, I do believe we are very, very close. Chapter 9. The revelation of Richard Lorimer's true heir changed everything. Evelyn Lorimer's claim to the estate had been questionable from the beginning. But now, with the existence of a legitimate heir, her disappearance no longer seemed like an isolated incident. It was part of something much larger, something planned. Inspector Graves and Miss Marple left the parish office in silence, both deep in thought. The cold night air pressed against them, thick with mist, wrapping the village in a veil of secrecy. Graves finally broke the silence. If James Lorimer had a child, then that person is the rightful heir. And if they knew about the inheritance, they might have arranged Evelyn's disappearance themselves. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. But there is another possibility. Someone else knew and decided to act before the truth could be discovered. Graves frowned. And that someone killed Phelps to cover their tracks. Miss Marple adjusted her scarf against the chill. It does seem rather likely. The constable on duty met them as they approached the police station. Sir, we've had a report from the Fox and Hound Inn. A man's been seen snooping around, asking questions about Evelyn Lorimer. Graves stiffened. Who? Didn't give a name, the constable replied, but the innkeeper said he had a foreign accent. Could be the missing heir. Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes flickered with interest. Or someone pretending to be. Graves turned to her. Do you think he's dangerous? Miss Marple's lips pursed. I think he is looking for something. And if we do not act quickly, he may find it before we do. A shadow in the night, they wasted no time. Within minutes, Graves, Miss Marple, and the constable were on their way back to the Fox and Hound Inn. The village was eerily quiet, the mist thickening around the street lamps, muffling their footsteps. The innkeeper met them at the door, looking uneasy. He left about 15 minutes ago, he said. Didn't say where he was going. Graves cursed under his breath. Which way? The innkeeper pointed down the road. Headed toward Heatherley Hall. Miss Marple and Graves exchanged a look. Then we must hurry, she said simply. A confrontation at Heatherley Hall. The grand estate loomed in the darkness, its windows dark, its silhouette foreboding against the night sky. The garden, where they had discovered the footprints earlier, lay in eerie silence. Then a sound, a soft rustling near the back of the house. Graves gestured for silence, hand on his revolver. Miss Marple, careful to remain behind him, observed the shifting shadows with quiet intensity. Another movement. A figure emerging from the darkness. "Stop where you are," Graves called. The figure hesitated for a fraction of a second, then bolted toward the trees. Graves took off after him, boots pounding against the damp grass. Miss Marple, though slower, moved quickly toward the house, where something else had caught her attention. The back door. It was open. With steady hands, she pushed it wider and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and something else. A faint scent of damp wool and candle wax. Someone had been inside recently. Then, from above, a creaking sound. Someone was still inside. The truth revealed. Miss Marple moved carefully through the darkened halls of Heatherly Hall, her steps light as she followed the faint creak of a floorboard. The house, once filled with grandeur, now held only echoes of secrets long buried. She reached the study, the same room where Evelyn had last been seen, and there, barely visible in the flickering light of a single candle, was a man. Tall, with a sharp jawline and dark hair streaked with grey. He was rifling through the desk drawers, his movements hurried, desperate. "Looking for something, Mr. Rawlings?" The voice, though soft, made him freeze. Slowly, he turned to face her. "Miss Marple." His voice was tight. "You seem rather eager to find something," she observed. Rawlings exhaled sharply. "You don't understand. I need proof. I need—" But before he could finish, another voice cut through the silence. "No, Mr. Rawlings. I need proof." Both turned toward the doorway, and there, stepping into the dim candlelight, was Evelyn Lorimer. Alive. Miss Marple's expression did not change, though inwardly her mind whirled. "Miss Lorimer," she said softly, "I must say, this is a most unexpected development." Evelyn's dark eyes were steady, but there was a fire behind them. "I had to disappear," she said, her voice edged with steel. "It was the only way to lure them out." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Them?" Evelyn took a slow breath. "I knew I wasn't the true heir. I found the old will days ago. But when I confronted Phelps about it, he warned me, told me that if I didn't keep quiet, I'd regret it." Miss Marple listened intently. "So I left," Evelyn continued. "Slipped away that night. I knew if I stayed, I'd end up like my uncle." She turned to Rawlings. "And I suspected you had something to do with it." Rawlings clenched his jaw. "I had nothing to do with your uncle's death." Evelyn narrowed her eyes. "No? Then why were you here 2 nights ago, threatening me?" Miss Marple studied them both. "Perhaps Mr. Rawlings was not threatening you, Miss Lorimer. Perhaps he was trying to warn you." Evelyn faltered. "What?" Miss Marple stepped forward. "Mr. Rawlings had doubts about your inheritance. He suspected fraud. And yet, if you were to suddenly disappear, the estate would revert back to those who manipulated the legal process to begin with." She turned to Rawlings. "Which is why you came back tonight. Not to harm Miss Lorimer, but to find proof of who was behind it all." Rawlings hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "Phelps wasn't the mastermind. He was a pawn." Miss Marple's sharp gaze locked onto Evelyn. "And I suspect you already know who the real culprit is?" Evelyn's fingers curled into fists. "Yes, I do." From the doorway, a new voice sneered. "And it's a shame you had to find out." They all turned. Standing in the shadows, holding a pistol, was Peter Bertram. Evelyn inhaled sharply. "You!" Bertram smirked. "Me." Miss Marple sighed. "Ah, I thought as much." Bertram's grip on the gun tightened. "The estate should have been mine. If you had just disappeared properly, Evelyn, none of this would have been necessary." "Graves'" voice rang out from behind him. "Drop it, Bertram." Bertram spun, startled, and in that moment Rawlings lunged. The gun clattered to the ground. In seconds, Graves had Bertram in handcuffs. Miss Marple exhaled softly. "Well, I must say, this has been quite the exhausting affair." Evelyn turned to her, eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Marple." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "My dear, one must always trust their instincts. And of course, a well-placed teacup never lies." Chapter 10. The village of St. Ethelred's awoke the next morning to the shocking news. Peter Bertram had been arrested for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder. The whispers spread through the cobbled streets faster than the morning mist, travelling from the baker's shop to the vicarage, from the Bluebell tea room to the butcher's counter. Miss Marple, ever composed, sipped her tea as she listened to the villagers recount the tale with varying degrees of embellishment. Some claimed Bertram had been caught red-handed, burying evidence in the Heatherly Gardens. Others insisted he had confessed everything on the spot, weeping like a child. The truth, as Miss Marple knew, was far simpler. Bertram had been desperate. When he discovered that Evelyn Lorimer had no rightful claim to the estate, he saw an opportunity. If Evelyn disappeared, there would be no one to contest the will, and in time the estate could be manipulated into his hands. It had been Bertram who had arranged Evelyn's disappearance. He had intercepted her as she left her room that night, convincing her she was in danger from Victor Rawlings. She had been frightened enough to flee with him, but she had quickly realized the real danger was Bertram himself. He had intended to keep her hidden long enough for the legal complications to force her out of the picture entirely. When Evelyn managed to escape from him, she did the only thing she could. She went into hiding, waiting for her moment to return and expose the truth. And now, thanks to Miss Marple's quiet deductions, that moment had come. A visit to Heatherly Hall. A few days later, Miss Marple found herself back at Heatherly Hall. The grand house still stood as it always had, but there was a different energy about it now, something lighter, as though the weight of deception had finally lifted from its walls. Evelyn Lorimer stood by the large bay window, gazing out over the grounds. She turned as Miss Marple entered, a warm but tired smile on her face. "I don't know how to thank you," Evelyn said. "If it weren't for you, I might still be running, or worse." Miss Marple adjusted her gloves and gave her a kind smile. "Nonsense, my dear. You had the good sense to suspect something was wrong. You simply needed a little help seeing the final pieces of the puzzle." Evelyn shook her head. "But how did you know? How did you suspect Bertram?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, my dear, it was all in the little things. His insistence that you and he would make a fine match. A rather presumptuous thing to say, don't you think? His alibi that night was weak at best, but the final clue was the footprints." Evelyn's brow furrowed. The footprints. Miss Marple nodded. The ones outside your window. They were too large for you, and yet they did not match the boots of Mr. Rawlings, as I checked when I visited him. That left only one real suspect. Someone close enough to you to manipulate you into leaving. Someone who knew of the old will and needed you gone before you could challenge it. Evelyn shivered slightly. I thought I could trust him. Miss Marple sighed. Unfortunately, my dear, trust is often misplaced when an inheritance is involved. The village returns to normal. With Bertram safely in custody and Evelyn's disappearance solved, the village of St. Ethelred's settled back into its usual rhythm. Mrs. Pettigrew had a new theory about the affair each morning. Mrs. Longworth took it upon herself to explain to anyone who would listen how she had suspected Bertram from the very beginning. And at the Bluebell Tea Room, Miss Finch whispered dramatically about the time Miss Marple outwitted a criminal with nothing but a cup of tea and a keen eye. Miss Marple, for her part, merely continued her knitting. Evelyn had made her decision. She would leave Heatherley Hall, returning to London where she could start fresh. I never really belonged here, she admitted to Miss Marple on her last day in the village. This house, it was never truly mine. Miss Marple smiled, understanding completely. Some places are only meant to be a passing chapter in our lives, my dear, and I believe your real story is just beginning. Evelyn hugged her tightly. You truly are remarkable, Miss Marple. Miss Marple chuckled softly. Oh, I'm just an old woman who listens, the final reflection. That evening, as Miss Marple sat by her fireside, a fresh pot of tea beside her, she allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. Justice had been served. Evelyn Lorimer was free, and the mystery of Heatherley Hall had been solved. But most importantly, human nature had once again proven itself to be as predictable as ever. She sipped her tea, a contented smile playing on her lips. After all, people could be quite dreadfully foolish when they thought no one was watching. The end.